Very, very good morning to you. So I am actually now back to being Ruth Mallors-Ray. And for the last 4 months, I've been the Interim Director for the National Space Partnership. And it's really great to have you here. I'm sure some of you are a little bit jet-lagged, whether that's from an early start this morning or from the events of last week. But it's great to see you in the room, and a very warm welcome to those who have joined us online too. So this morning we've heard from government, we've heard from industry, and we've heard from academia. We've heard from those talking at the national level. We've heard from those at the, well, sort of at the devolved level. You heard some notes from the community. You've heard from the regional, the civil, and the defence. And without a doubt, you know, there has been a phenomenal amount of work in the last 10 years, as Stuart mentioned. But also, even just in the last couple of years, with the establishment of a Space Command, the publication of a dual strategy, the National Space Strategy, the Defence Space Strategy, the establishment of a National Space Board, a move from industry to create an industry board, an academic board from academia. And, you know, as Jules said, it's not broken. There are a vast amount of activities and discussions going on. But the question I always have is, where do those conversations come together? Where do the needs of the government agenda, the industrial agenda, and the academic agenda come together? And so we bring, you know, the idea of a national space partnership to bring us some focus, to bring us some drive, and to bring us some delivery. And the National Space Partnership is aspiring to sit squarely across the government, the industry, and the academic community. And some of you have heard me speak on webinars, some of you know me really well. I sit in this space very comfortably. I am completely biased of the value of this space sitting in government, industry, and academia, of not being government, not being industry, not being academia, but being the sum of those parts. Creating a unity of approach, identifying key things that we can do together, that we all need to do together, whether that's capability road mapping, market export agendas, science strategy, a growth strategy, but supporting ultimately the delivery of the National Space Strategy. So if I just talk to that a little bit, you know, the concept of the National Space Partnership is to identify emerging and developing opportunities relevant to the UK sector. And we need to build and collate the work being done by the Catapult, by companies, by UK Space, by the regions, by academia and others to forge that dialogue. We need that strategy. And we need to be able to map the capabilities from across the UK space sector as an ongoing live activity, referencing opportunities, highlighting areas of capability. And this will recognise the work that has been done. So the work of KTN in the landscape documents that they have online, the work of the Catapult, the capability mapping that they've done. But it needs to be live, it needs to be active. It needs to be targeting the challenges and the opportunities facing us today here in the UK. We need to create strategies that deliver these opportunities, connecting with the stakeholders inside and outside of the UK space sector. We need to create a corporate knowledge of strategies, opportunities, challenges and successful interventions. And I really believe that the National Space Partnership can look for those opportunities by talking to the community, look at the capabilities that we have in the UK to deliver them, or indeed that we don't have and that we need to reach outside to bring back in, and then create the strategy to drive that forwards. And then, you know, the other point that I think the National Space Partnership really needs to try and take ownership of is establishing an R&D portfolio, and even beyond that, a portfolio of investments. And the reason for this is because it doesn't exist. So in a recent Space Select Committee, the Chief Exec of the UK Space Agency was asked this. It doesn't exist. Somebody else who was on the committee, I can't remember who it was, but they were asked, it doesn't exist. So how can we target where our investments need to go so we don't duplicate if we don't know where we've invested already? This is not an easy task, and I understand it's not an easy task. You know, it requires a huge amount of very sensitive information to be collated. It needs to be able to squirrel around into UKRI, into the research councils, into STSC. It needs to be able to have very sensitive conversations with industry, with academia on where this goes. But you guys need a portfolio. We need to know where we're investing aligned to the strategy so we know which gaps to fill. And lastly, there's a need to carry out some specific tasks in response to an urgent critical need. So in recent weeks, the sad, very awful events of Ukraine have highlighted the need to be able to do some scenario planning on our launch capabilities, for instance. That is an example where being able to reach out to an independent group of capability to do some planning and some thinking around that would have been really advantageous. And it has happened, of course it's happened, but it's happened in a different way. And so this ability to do some tasking. And so we need to, try and bring these things together. And later on in this morning's session, you're going to hear about this idea, testing this idea through the pilot of the last 4 months of an opportunity, testing the idea of a capability alignment, and testing the idea of some task and finish. So ultimately, what the NSP is trying to go towards, is to deliver a perspective on the UK portfolio over time, where we're investing, against what capabilities, how does that map to the strategy. We're seeking to create strategies of consensus. This has been a conversation over the last 4 months that keeps coming up, that we can't reach consensus, Ruth. We can't decide what the priorities are. However, we can create strategies of consensus. It doesn't have to be a single consensus on the whole of the space community and where it wants to go, but we can move to strategies of consensus. And we need some trusted insight. And, this is where the independence really comes in. And we need that body that is neutral, it is without agenda. It's not government, it's not industry, it's not academia, it's not an institution. It's just a body of knowledge that has reached out to all those parties and created a perspective. So that we realise some objectives. We create a trusted forum, able to exchange ideas, identify challenges and opportunities. We're able to progress those effective strategies, unblock some blockages, reach into the regions, into the clusters, into the four corners of the UK to drive that forwards, and to provide the evidence. This is really important. Government does invest, but it invests when there's really solid evidence, whether that's a market failure, a market opportunity, an academic weakening, skills weakening, but it does invest, but it has to have the evidence. And the evidence has to align to government policies and to their strategies, and it also has to align to industries and academics' requirements. And so ultimately, what the National Space Partnership is aspiring to do is to help accelerate the implementation of the National Space Strategy. We need to start moving forwards. We need to start getting it done. And whilst it's important to talk about what we are going to do and what we have been trying to pilot and try to explore, I think it's also really as important, if not more important, to articulate what we're not doing. And this gives people comfort about where your focus is, where your agendas do or don't lie. So it is the intention that the NSP, the National Space Partnership, will not fund R&D. It will not conduct that R&D, it will not do that R&D, it will not sit in a lab with some test tubes, doing whatever that looks like, but it will not do it. That is for the role of government, and industry and academia to do. The NSP will not specify tender conditions for any individual programmes. These are policy decisions for the funder to make. The NSP might be called upon to look at the requirements for a tender. They might be wanting to get some unique perspective on the requirements, to test that in a different way, but they will not specify the conditions. We won't act as a funding body, so we won't have any money, I'm afraid, to do an experiment, to do some R&D, to do that sort of things. The NSP will not be a funding body. And last but not least, and this point is really important, the National Space Partnership will not lobby government. As it's working with government, it can't lobby it. As it's going to probably be part funded by government and academia and industry, it can't lobby it. but it can be a trusted, clear, articulate voice. It can be the provider of evidence, and it can be the accelerator of strategies to go forwards. So the National Space Partnership, in how I often talk about it, sits in no man's land, or no person's land, to be gender specific, gender correct. We sit between government and industry and academia, and we bring that conversation together, whatever that conversation might be. And so I'm now going to turn to my colleagues who have been working with me over the last four months. Whilst I may well be known to you, I think you will all absolutely agree I'm not a space expert. So we surrounded me by some space experts. So we're going to hear about some market-led strategies that leverage space systems from Andy Shaw and Andrew Davies. We're going to hear about some capability shaping through market understanding from Andy Proctor. We're going to hear from Mark Presley about responsive tasking, a very specific item to do with regulatory launch capabilities. And we're going to hear again from James Endicott about the role of academia in space via the NSP. Andy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Andy Shaw. You have to be called Andy to work in the NSP, apparently. I'm going to talk to you about green finance. Now, we've heard about what's meaningful space. Let me get to green finance. Well, let's start with a big number, shall we? What's meaningful? This is the number that McKinsey Global Institute estimates is the amount of capital required to invest in sustainable land use and energy production systems in the next 20 to 30 years. That's about 9.3 billion per annum, trillion per annum, sorry, trillion, not billion. There's a lot, as you see, number 2 on our list here is fighting climate change. So we've been looking at, amongst a portfolio of market need, where does this issue of fighting climate arise? And we looked across food sector, or the different sectors, but you realise there's a big sector that the UK also leads on that often doesn't really get talked about in this sense, and that's the finance sector. This money is not going to come from the public purse alone. It needs to come from the private sector, and of course private sector asset owners and managers are handling money on your behalf and my behalf. It's our pension funds, it's the high net worth individuals, it's sovereign wealth funds. And this money is going to have to be deployed globally to both meet net zero targets by reducing or removing our greenhouse gas emissions, or by helping us adapt to and become more resilient to the kind of climate change that we're already experiencing. So what's this got to do with space? Has space got anything to do with it? Well, yes, of course. We don't start with a blank sheet of paper. Satellites have delivered global evidence that has been used in weather forecasting, climate science, ecology, for many years now. The National Centre for Earth Observation, where I used to work, spends a lot of money each year helping understand the changing nature of our planet, the atmospheric dynamics, oceanographic dynamics, etc., etc. This figure comes from, it's actually quoted by the Australian Space Agency, who, in parallel to us in the UK, have been launching their own space strategy. And it's a figure that represents what they believe to be the value of Earth observation to the world's economic and social system. So it's not just commercial markets, but it's the spin-off benefits of using Earth observation data and science for the benefit of society. So I think it captures things like the value of weather forecasting. So we are not starting from standstill with space and the finance sector. Well, is it all done then? No, it's not all done. And what the NSP has been looking at is, well, what are the needs that are emerging and arising now that we can help you with? The finance sector is a large, complex system. It represents something like 20% GDP of the UK. You probably can't see this, I'm really sorry. I thought the screens might be a bit larger when we came today. But it covers a lot, the whole panoply. Let me bring up the next slide, because then it helps you understand some of the subsectors. Institutional investors, the hedge funds, the pension funds, the investment houses that manage money on our behalf. The banks and insurance sector. We've spoken to the likes of NatWest during this process, and even a bank that you say, well, what have they got to do with data around climate change? They are very interested in helping them meet their own net zero targets, but also make better green investments. We've got government sector, sovereign wealth funds, and you might be familiar with, for instance, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund that's been funding the acquisition of Planet data. I think I just met someone from Planet here today, but they've been buying data of the global tropical forests and making that data available so that people can track and monitor the impact of supply chains on tropical forests. And then you've got the likes of the third sector, the philanthropic and third sector. WWF in particular are very engaged in this area right now. They call it geospatial ESG. What does that mean? So it's to do with geospatial. I'm a geographer, I colouring maps for a living, so I'm glad they're using that kind of terminology. ESG is environment, social governance. It's a class of funds that all our money goes into. And if you get classed as ESG, then people will invest in your fund because they think it's going to help deliver to green outcomes. Not always the case. There's a huge range of definitions of ESG. Different people have different definitions, and there's a lot of confusion about what truly constitutes a green fund. And so they're asking questions. How do we compare like for like? If you're a company doing this or doing that or doing that, how do we compare your greenhouse gas emissions or your exposure to climate risk? So there's a big, complex value chain, and we're starting to piece together a picture. And I think there's one thing that NSP can do on behalf of us as a community. I work for an SME. I would not have time to do this exploration on my own when you've got a business to run. So NSP, for me, can do this work, convene the right kind of people in the room, look at it from a strategic perspective, and hopefully turn to the sector and say, look, these are the kind of things we're learning. So what have we learned so far? It's been a short piece of work. We've really just scratching the surface, but we can definitely say we're learning that green finance requires a range of data to meet emerging regulatory and risk management needs. So we boiled it down to those two areas. I know there are a lot more than that if you're in this area, and we could talk a lot about it. But regulatory, there's something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, led by Michael Bloomberg of the Bloomberg Empire, and people like Mark Carney, previously head of our own Bank of England. And Rishi Sunak has accepted their recommendations for saying we have to ask companies to start reporting. It's a compliance issue, reporting on their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, but also their exposure to climate risk. Their shareholders, the pension funds that that invest in them, they all need to know. And you're not going to get away with it any longer, acting with impunity and not worrying about the externalities of environmental damage. But that's an overhead on companies. It's not a thing that makes them money, it's an overhead. So how can we help them efficiently meet their reporting tasks? At the same time, what is a business issue is operational risk. If we've just come back from Australia, and if you were operating in Australia, you'd probably be very worried either about major floods caused by La Nina, or you're worried about the wildfires and how often these are going to occur, and are they going to damage our ability to operate in future? Climate risk, how do we inform that? We need lots of data. So we found there's a whole raft of needs, and we're just scratching the surface, and the UK has a strategy called the Green Finance Strategy, which aspires to deliver on this, and they call it two things. Greening finance, so the finance sector itself, the city, on all its players becoming more green. Prove to us that you are green. And it's about financing green. So we are going to invest in greener, better, more sustainable, more resilient projects. That's the 275 trillion that has to be invested. But where do you invest? Well, don't invest in somewhere that's clearly going to become more risky. So there's way more to do, and that's where space can come into to play by delivering a lot of the data. We're by no means the only player. You need to collect our data, but to integrate it with all sorts of other data. You need to run it through all kinds of complex risk models. But what we've learned in talking to various groups, and there's lots of reports out there that you can find out about, it's not just me. Like I mentioned, if you go and look at one, go and look at the World Wildlife Fund's Geospatial ESG report. It sets out very nicely the challenges that they face holding companies to account. They cannot do their job without Earth observation data. And I apologize, I am focusing mainly on EO today. That's because that's my background. You'll hear from the other guys later. But there's all sorts of other enabling technology required, the location-specific kind of stuff as well, and the ability to move data around. But in terms of just the data itself, incomplete records, we can't always get the data we need when we want it. We know it's kind of in archives somewhere, but we don't have the ability to stitch it together, make use of it. So there's lots of confusion, there's lots of incomplete data records. And then there's a lack of kind of open standards around what standards should a certain data set adhere to if you're trying to equate data to, say, a measure of risk. All kinds of needs. So there is lots of discussion to be had with the finance community about how we help them with that. And given the importance of the financial sector in the City of London, but also Edinburgh and clusters like, I spoke to a colleague from the west of England, and there's a growing cluster of financial services companies there, we need to get that conversation working together so that we can fully understand what the next generation of needs and products are going to be, and then see how we can help deliver on that. And we can put the UK in the centre of this. So we learned together with all the people we've spoken to, I've mentioned a few that we've spoken to, that we need to talk more. We need to develop partnerships. We need to work together much more. And that was the aspiration of the NSP, and that was the challenge that Ruth gave us at the beginning. Go out there, find out about needs. Don't talk about widgets and gadgets and technology. Find out if there is a need, and if these guys will then come to the table to help develop programs over time that we can, like we said, as an independent, trusted authority can say, this, we lay out what we think are the needs right now. So these are some of the things we've suggested. Aligning data solutions to need, designing appropriate delivery mechanisms. We're not making any assumptions yet about whether it should be a commercially led. There might be a call for better, stronger public services in this area. We already had a world-class meteorological office delivering great weather forecasts, and the Hadley Centre doing more science. It might be that for the city, the best solution here is to put all that data into a new public-supported entity, which then makes all that stuff available to everyone in an open and fair way. But it might not be, and of course we want to be building commercial advantage and leadership for the UK. So we feel that this requires more partnerships, more discussion and dialogue between the various sectors mentioned there, including the third sector, including our world-class academic and research community. And we would hope that the outcomes of this kind of dialogue ought to be self-evident. You know, we're talking about one of the largest sectors of the UK economy with a huge task to help put right what we've got wrong over the last decades. That's going to need a lot of support from a whole range of beneficiaries. It also can help deliver to many other government strategies, such as the geospatial strategy, such as the national food strategy. Go and read the national food strategy. It's not all about calories and obesity. There's a lot in there about land use and how we've got to redesign, rethink and reimagine how we're going to use our land, but also what our exposure to overseas emissions will be. And that 2.7 trillion market will grow. The needs are not going away. They're only getting more and more acute as we go through time. But where is our share in that? And I'm sure there must be strategies we can pursue to grow our share and position us, along with our colleagues in the finance sector, as part of the solution to climate change. We've spent a lot of time telling people what the problem is. Now we've got to start helping people create solutions. And one of those areas of solutions is going to be how we manage our major cities around the world. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Andrew Davies now, who's going to build, hopefully on what I've just said, but add in some new nuggets for you to think about in terms of smart and greener cities. Thanks, Andrew.
Hello. I started today with a 2-minute YouTube video on how to put on a necktie, because I haven't done that for about 3 years. And I realised I spent a large part of my working life in a state of semi-asphyxiation. So, starved of oxygen again. I'll do the best I can. Right, smart green cities. This was one of the work streams that we decided to look at in the NSP. And I can't actually see the slides in it. I won't ask for a box like Tom Cruise. I'll just have to lean forward a bit. Right, smart green cities, what is it? Well, there we go. Globally, there's about 900 initiatives to make cities smarter. What does that mean? Well, smart basically means it's digitally enabled to be more efficient as a city, to deliver more services as a city for the citizens. Green city is slightly different. It's a city that's a living and working environment that is sustainable for the citizens. But actually, digitally enabling a city generally these days tends to embrace the green principle that cities have to be smarter, more sustainable, and of course, aim for net zero carbon. And that's sort of the basis of the Smart City Initiative. Now, where does space fit in? Initially, we parked the idea of space and say, let's look at these initiatives, let's see what they are doing, let's see how they work, and try and understand what the overall picture is before we try and insert any kind of space application or service. So I didn't travel up to Manchester and talk to the leader of the council with a travelling wave tube in my pocket, because that would have been inappropriate. How did we do this? We had a team of 12 secondees, and I'd like to thank everyone who contributed. And we did a fair amount of desk research to understand what we meant by a smart city, what it actually did, what initiatives were going on now. There's about 40 of them in the UK, differing levels of depth and scope, but they're still very much the idea that people want to make their cities smarter. One of those cities, Manchester, stood out because they say we're going to be the smartest, greenest city in Europe, which is an interesting, bold claim, but it is also something they want to actually achieve over the next 5 years. As well as desk research, we actually decided we need to engage with the people who are involved in this to understand what this is. And we talked to a number of cities. We talked to both the public and the private sector. We did travel up to Manchester. We talked to the leader of the council. We talked to their new digital team, because they have just launched their digital strategy. It's launched actually in March of this year. It's for the 5 years, and it's how they're going to make their city smarter, greener, a great place to live and to work. And that was a very good opportunity to network with people who are actively engaged in this idea of smart cities. And on the way back at the airport, I was able to network with a very large group of extremely angry people trying to get on an aeroplane. So it was a great day out. But from that, we did identify some of the main themes and some of the challenges that we were going to have to address in trying to understand potentially where space could play a role. So I'll go very quickly through this, because there is a report available, and from that you can actually read in more depth what we actually did. But we learned that smart green cities need a ubiquitous, secure and resilient connectivity infrastructure to deliver the digital services that they plan to make them smarter. And this obviously supports a lot of issues like delivery to the citizens, delivery to the enterprise. Manchester is very keen on becoming a very big digital hub, a digital enterprise hub. They already have 5 digital unicorns, and they hope to have 13 within the next 2 years. And for that, they need the infrastructure and they need the working base for these companies to establish themselves and to grow very quickly. Those workforces are becoming more dispersed. One thing COVID has given us is a more remote working, a greater dispersed workforce who still need the same level of connectivity engagement that they actually get when they're actually in the workplace. And greater mobility. And one of the issues with that is that they need to understand the state of the city, they need to find more data about the city, they need to have efficient and integrated transport infrastructures. So there's a lot of platforms moving around that need to communicate seamlessly. And the interesting thing is that there are areas where space could potentially play into that. Obviously, everyone is familiar with the role of OneWeb as a new UK capability. But also, we have our own SATCOMs companies based in the UK, Avanti and Inmarsat, very much at the forefront of this kind of work, and also in Internet of Things. And one of the issues that came out of this is that actually you're not looking at stovepipe solutions for a specific problem. You're looking more widely, geographically, about what does a region need and what partnerships are necessary to deliver that. We also learned that the smart green cities need reliable, timely and actionable data delivered to the point where it is most needed. And this is one of the key things, is that actually it's very good to have strategies for how you're going to become smarter, greener, you're going to become more efficient with your building stock, but actually, how do you know? How do you know that? What do you know about your city? What is the heat map of the city? What is the air quality? What is the carbon footprint? How do you continue to monitor it? And quite clearly there, this links into what Andy was saying before me, the aim of using Earth observation data coupled with other data, ground-based data, to actually provide actionable data that can be delivered for the purpose of understanding and making the city greener. We also learn that to deliver this, we need to develop partnerships that go somewhat outside the traditional partnerships we have within the space industry. The first thing we need to do is we need to work with the organisations involved to understand what the real need is. What is the common need? And for us to then decide within that need where space applications and services could potentially play a role. And it really is, it's got to come from them, it's got to come from the market, it's got to say, we want to do the following things, and for us to understand how that might fit. And the other issue is, how do you deliver a sustainable programme? Because one of the problems with a lot of these is that, we've talked about the Manchester Initiative, 5 years. What actually happens after 5 years? How do you embed within the processes of a city the way you're actually delivering these services so they become sustainable long term? Those partnerships require the public sector as the anchor users, the people who are the driver of the user need, and two very good examples of that are the Manchester Digital Strategy and the Belfast Region City Deal, both of which we examined in some detail. Manchester calls it the Digital Strategy. They've moved away from this idea of smart cities because they think that if they become totally digitally enabled, smart and green will follow. You also need the private sector, the people who can deliver these, and there are a lot of organisations already engaged with cities in delivering these kinds of services. And they're not from the space sector mostly. They are mostly from completely different sectors. And that partnership needs to come together. A very good example in Manchester is what they call they have a resilient architecture, the CNI architecture, which is they want to build an infrastructure that is common and available to all organisations that need to draw from it, for communications, for moving data around. And they would like a partnership between the local government and the providers of those communication services to deliver this. And that's an example of a particular strategy they've got that may be of interest. Finally, the private sector can also be the beneficiary and potentially the investor. One of the legs that we haven't quite examined is who's going to pay for all this? How is it going to be financed? And what sources of finance can be brought in to these initiatives? And what kind of partnerships can deliver them? And the other part of it is that actually, if you look at a city, most of it is privately owned. And there are some very, very large organisations who manage the assets, the land of the city. And a very good example is one I've listed down there, Brentwood. Brentwood actually have a lot of properties in the north of England that they manage for both local government and private companies. If you go to their website, they are committed to become sustainable. They are committed to low carbon. But in their presentation, they actually said, we've made these commitments. Actually, we really don't know how we're doing. The example they gave is, when we build new parking spaces, we put electric charge points in. We have no idea if anybody actually uses them. When we build or take over refurbished buildings, we make them more efficient, more heat efficient. But we have no idea how much more efficient. And there is demand to actually understand the state of the assets, to understand that and to use that to demonstrate that what they are doing is effective, that they are making the city greener. So to summarise, there are potentially some interesting strands could be extracted from this, but not next week. It's going to take a little bit of time to work with the potential stakeholders to understand what is the issue we're trying to resolve and how potentially can we contribute from the space sector. That's not going to be an overnight success. But interestingly enough, it does directly address two of the goals of the National Space Strategy, and it could potentially also help underpin some of these smart city initiatives. And one of the great benefits, of course, of the space industry is that if you can get something to work in one place, you can probably get it to work in many places, not just in the UK, but globally. And always hold in mind that number, that there's 900 of these initiatives globally at the moment, and that's going to grow. And that's the potential opportunity in smart green cities. Thank you very much.
Crikey, even I can't see that. Right, so thanks very much, everybody. What I'm going to talk about is something very similar, and you'll see that there's a theme here about us working at the markets level rather than at the sort of space level and pushing capability onto markets. What we're really trying to do, and the salesmen amongst you will know this, is trying to get away from the product sales type company focus and look at the markets and then see where the pull is. That's really what the NSP activity so far has been about. And what I'm going to talk about is a case study that refers to intelligent supply chains. It starts with the National Space Strategy, and within the NSS, our role here is, as Ruth said earlier, to accelerate the delivery of this strategy and in combination with the Defence Space Strategy. It says we're going to take action to grow the sector. It says we're going to collaborate internationally, and it says we're going to have more resilient services. So what I'm going to talk about here is, as well as identifying the opportunities in green finance and smart cities, for example, I'm going to try and take it one step further and say, okay, what are the specific capabilities that the space sector can bring to the party to deliver on those things mentioned in the NSS. The NSS identifies the high growth areas in navigation and Earth observation and satellite comms and space domain awareness, but also that's sometimes called space traffic management. A lot of you might know I'm a PNT guy, and of course PNT figures in all of those. You don't have Earth observation capabilities without knowing where things are. You don't know your space domain awareness without being able to say where things are. You don't have navigation without understanding where you are. And you generally don't have communications systems without knowing when you are. So that's the reason why I was asked to come and help out here. The technical annex of the National Space Strategy, which hasn't really been spoken about today, I think is worth a read as well. That does identify a lot of the statistics, the reports, and the studies that it draws from to make the conclusions that it does. So if you haven't read that, I would recommend reading that document. Some of those reports are here. So it's taken information about the markets and some of the technologies, and what it really does is they set the scenes for how and where this growth is going to come from. Supply chains and food are highlighted within the National Space Strategy, but also in some of the documents you can see here, as growth opportunity, as is the finance sector and smart digital cities. But what does that really mean? It's all very well identifying opportunities, but me being if people that know me know I'm a practical sort of chap, and I always ask, so what? So the work that we've done, we started looking at some of these other reports and taking the technical annex and the National Space Strategy. You can start to do a bit of a dive into these reports here. And one of the other reports that probably hasn't been shown around too much is called the Space Enabled Systems Report, sponsored by UK Space. This looked at future intelligent supply chains, food, connectivity, asset management, and it highlighted particularly PNT, but also SATCOMs and EO in this logistics and supply chains area. We know that EO gives you geospatial data. Location is no good unless you have a reference for it. So it's all very well knowing your X, Y, and Z coordinates, but what does that actually mean? And that's why we have latitude, longitude, and height, and maps, so we can understand where we are in a reference frame. So all of this really is, okay, so when you look through these strategies, when you look through the documents, it says, yes, we need PNT, we need location. And it's some of these are relatively flippant. But what I did with a group of people, who I thank, by the way, what I did with a group of people is we looked into these documents in a little bit more depth, and we started to see, okay, it mentions the word location or time, and as you see on here, we're talking about aircraft landing. What does that really mean? How does location enable these strategies to be successful? And the more that we delved down, the more we found commonality, as it were. So when you look across the macro strategies, the ones I've just shown in aviation, maritime and rail, you've got borders. Then we went to the food strategy with Andy, and we then went into the national AI strategy, the data strategy, the cyber strategy, the innovation strategy. We got into them all. And what we find is that space is really pretty essential to everything in all of these strategies. They all are enabled by space. In some ways, they all need location. They all need to be able to communicate. They all need to have geospatial data of some form to be successful. It's not the only thing that some of these need, of course. There'll be physical infrastructure. But we're talking about how can the National Space Strategy enable these strategies to be successful. If you also took a look back, which we did in 2015, there was an industrial strategy published, and that talked about the same things. We need to have location, we need to have time, we need to have communications, all things the space sector can provide. The 2010 Innovation and Growth Strategy, and before that the IGT, similar types of activities. So we knew we were on fairly strong ground in terms of our emerging assumptions. But what did we find across all of these areas? We found really common threads. The common threads in this case are resilience, location and timing, and communications. I would, for now, clump geospatial data into location and timing because they are hand in hand. It's not just about space, it's not just about space technologies. Here we're just identifying the common threads across all of these approaches. All of these documents we've reviewed look to the future. They look to 2030, 2050 and beyond. But to get to where they need to be, they need these three things primarily. But so what? What about space? This is where you would then need your specialists. So Ruth said earlier on about needing people around her that know the market, know the technologies. So it's at this point where you start to think, okay, what can space really do to help? What can space add value to above and beyond current technologies and the evolution of those current technologies to actually make a difference to those market approaches? And that's really what we've been looking at. And we also need to be, as mentioned earlier on, realistic. We have to understand what we can do, what we cannot do, and what we shouldn't do, because otherwise we just waste money. Some of you know I used to work at the Innovation Agency, and sometimes funding a project where we know that we're halfway through, you know it's going to fail, is just as valuable as when you know that something's going to succeed. So you have to understand where you're not going to play as well as where you are going to play. So those three fundamental factors that go across all of the strategies and documents and studies and analyses that we reviewed, we then tested those out in the marketplace. So we came out to the market into companies and lots of phone calls, which really is testing, talking, sharing, collaborating, testing again, and then talking again, and so on and so forth. This is just a few of the organisations. Lots more were consulted. But once we've tested it and you know that you got something, you know that you're onto a real path of success here, there needs to be somebody to lead. There needs to be somebody to step up and take that brave step to say, follow me. And that's really what the space strategy is trying to do. And it's what the NSP is there to support the delivery of. And that's, for me, the value that this activity will bring. So for the intelligent supply chains, in line with everyone else, there is a so what. There is a what did we learn. So location and timing, resilient communications, well, resilience and communications can enable the future of our supply chain and logistics sectors. There is a document that's going to be published on the website, which is the strategic case for intelligent supply chains. That's just an extract from it. Feel free to read. I don't intend reading through everything. But essentially, it's referenced, it's evidenced, it talks about the what we can do, the why we can do it, the how we can do it, and even some of the who should do it. So therefore, overall, we've learned supply chains need to be treated, and this is a good conclusion, in a similar way to critical infrastructure for planning and continuity purposes. If you, as the strategic case talks about, break it down, there are failures of communication within supply chains. We need to get over those. We need to have capabilities in the UK to improve the accuracy, the integrity, and the trust of systems for the future. Trust is an interesting one because people then think about the technical aspects of jamming and spoofing, and not just in PNT but in communications. But what I would say, there's a very good report. I think it's called Among Us the Stars from 2018, 2019, and that shows how serious the issue of threats and hazards and misleading information is in the civil domain. And it shows that these things that are talked about are real. We also need to interoperate with other systems. We need to be interoperable with non-space systems. We need to treat 5G as a partner and not as a threat. We need to talk about what does LoRa mean for us, whether it's LoRa from space or LoRa from the ground. We need to think about terrestrial PNT, how do we integrate it, and we need to think about how do we provide integrity for those GNSS services we already use today that we know are vulnerable and we know can be misleading. And I think that's my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. My name's Mark Presley. I'm the odd one out in the leadership team. I'm not called Andy or Andrew. But I'm here to talk to you about one of the responsive tasks that the NSP was asked to undertake during the pilot phase. The talk really is less about the actual task itself and what emerged from it, rather the process that we went through to enable it and how we reached the conclusions we did and why the NSP was asked to undertake the challenge in the first place. The task was commissioned by the Department for Transport and the Spaceflight Safety Regulatory Council, its co-chair in fact, to canvass views on the council members on the UK space regulatory framework. Now, why did they challenge us? Why did they ask us to look at this? Well, basically, there were many voices on the subject of the space regulatory framework, and not all of them were coming through very clearly. Indeed, it emerged that when we started the task, there were 7 other reviews underway, plus a ministerial review as well. So there was lots of different angles coming onto this task. And the council were looking for something to gain traction on, to really move the discussion forward within the council and more broadly, that they could then actually really get a move with the issues that might be at foot. So they asked us to really seek to understand some areas of consensus, i.e. where members of the council felt that the regulatory framework was good for purpose and that they could engage with, but also areas of contention that required change. And this was the main area, but we were keen to balance the two off, so it wasn't just a list of areas of change and conflict. It was also trying to identify an area where there was consensus and you can actually build on that and move it forward positively. Why the NSP? Well, I think, first of all, we were perceived as being able to act as an independent, trusted facilitator and able then to use the evidence from the interviews we conducted to synthesize the options or the opinions that we had heard into some tangible report that could then be used by the council to take things forward. And our role really was to listen and be inquisitive. We certainly didn't put ourselves up there as experts in the regulatory framework, indeed any area of that at all. As I said, our job was really to talk to the people, listen, and actually try and synthesize the reports. The approach we took was very much focused on a very agile and pacey conclusion to the report. So we were tasked on the 11th of March and we delivered the report on the 25th of March. So just a 2-week period to actually undertake this whole task. We're aware that it was actually in the pipeline. The steering group had talked about it. It was there. We just needed to wait for the chance to come out from the Department for Transport and the co-chair of the council. So whilst that 2 weeks was just the period of the task itself, we were aware of it in the wings and waiting to come forward. But within that 2 weeks, we were able to contact all the council members and fix interviews with them. So we got interviews with 17 of the 27 members, which over a 2-week period, when you consider people's diaries, which I think was a really good response rate as far as we were concerned. Added to that, we also talked to the CAA and to the Department for Transport as well. So we got a pretty good broad view across the council membership. We conducted very short, focused, 15-minute interviews with each of the council members that we spoke to. So in 15 minutes, it's not very long, really, to talk about what is quite a complex and difficult subject, i.e. space regulatory framework and licensing in the UK. But it did focus the interview, and it did allow us to actually boil down the conversation to one area that the interviewee had consensus with, were happy with the regulatory framework, were content to move it forward. But also, they had to then distill their thoughts into just 1 or 2 areas of contention that they were looking for us to note and move forward. So that short 15-minute interview technique really paid dividends, I think, in terms of focusing people's mind. The result was a very short 4-page report which synthesized the views from the interviewees. We were trying to write this as we went along, gathering reports, and it became very clear that there were some common themes emerging, but we left that to the end and then synthesized them. I won't go into great detail about what those areas of consensus or contention were. That's for the council. But I will give you some broad views as to the sort of areas that it hit upon. There was one clear point of consensus that we were able to highlight to the council, and that was related to the CAA and it being the correct body in view of the members to actually deal with the UK space regulatory framework. So that's a very positive finding that the council could think, okay, right, we're in the right ballpark here, and the CAA are accepted as the right people to do the job. We can actually move forward on that. So that was a very positive consensus point that we unearthed. The areas of contention that we heard about from the people we interviewed were able to be distilled into broadly 3 key themes. But interestingly, not all of those themes were actually to do with the space regulatory framework. So a lot of the discussion and the noise in the debate was not necessarily around the regulatory framework. There were other areas that could be addressed which could actually move things forward without looking to change the regulatory framework and take that through Parliament and all the challenges that that would present. A couple of those areas were involved in the process of applying for licenses and how that unfolded, and the fact that a lot of the organisations who were applying for those licenses were equally applying for environmental licenses, noise reduction licenses in the US and in other places in the world as well. So it was that process which was perhaps not as streamlined as it could be. It was also an area of expectation. There was a difference of expectation between the CAA and what they were looking for and the people applying for licenses. Some people would put in place an 18-month process to actually get the license delivered. But others were expecting it more as a commodity to be turned around in a very short time, which wasn't exactly feasible. So the process and the expectation were areas that the council could engage with and actually perhaps move things forward. We presented the work to the council about 3 weeks ago now, and then after the short presentation there was an extensive Q&A which we sort of delved into some of the more detailed responses that we got from the interviewees. And I think an indication of the challenge that the council faced was that in that call there were 50 people on the call. There were some observers to the council and there was the council members. So it emerged that actually this was a good example that there was a lot of voices here, not all of whom actually had a stake in the actual regulatory framework itself. So there was an insight we were able to provide there. Overall, it was a fascinating insight from my perspective. And we were able to very quickly get in touch with people, have those short, focused interviews, and draw out of those interviewees the areas of consensus to build on, and areas of contention that the council could actually move forward on and try and engage and take the process forward. Indeed, we did get a positive response from the people we interviewed on the role of the National Space Partnership and how an independent, trusted body can actually hold these conversations, synthesize the results, and offer in a report in a way that's not biased to any other stakeholder in the room. So that was a real positive output for the NSP. So that's a very quick briefing on this one short notice tasking that we've conducted in the pilot phase. And I'll now hand over to James, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the Space Academic Network and some of the pieces that they've done. James, over to you.
Hello again. So this talk is about, I guess, one of the activities under the National Space Partnership Pilot. So here, what we did was to sort of dip into the world of academia and academic impact. There were 5 case studies that were produced by 5 fellows. So the titles are there. The first one was Quantum Technologies in the Space Domain. Second was about success in cosmic visions and opportunities for future UK leadership. I should point out who coordinated these. So the first one was written by Susan Spetsova at University of Strathclyde. Lucia from Portsmouth University wrote the second one. The third case study was about how the UK benefits from ESA Earth observation missions. That was written by Steve Baker at Mallard Space Science Lab and UCL. The fourth was A Hunt for Dark Matter, written by Fiona Thompson from Durham University, and Fiona's here today. The fifth one was Ensuring Space Mission Engineering Success, and that was written by Leah Nani Alcanov from Birmingham University. So, a bit of background to this. As I mentioned in my first talk today, one of our sort of goals was to have some fellows to support the activities of SPAN. As our network has grown, there are more things that we need to be involved in. We need support to our working groups. We also wanted to create regional and geographic presence around the UK so that we have presence in the devolved administrations and can interact more easily with academia and industry alike across the UK. So there's a number of reasons which we were interested in having SPAN fellows. In this particular context, the business cases were sort of identified with a view to helping provide some input to the Space Agency, who are the custodians of the business case for the Eastern Ministerial. Each fellow had a completely free rein as to what they wrote about, so their personal case studies about what they know, so not trying to cover the whole breadth of academic research for space. And the criteria set by the agency was that it should be more of a story, less about metrics, but more about those kind of messages that sort of inspire. So yes, as I've said, the fellows were funded by National Space Partnership, and through the work we also highlighted links to the National Space Strategy. So in terms of some of the key takeaways from quantum technology in the space domain, it was slightly different to some of the other case studies. So it was more of a bit of a survey or an overview piece of quantum technologies. So some of the key findings were, we think that the UK is in an excellent position, or well placed to capitalize on its leading position in quantum technologies. You know, there's been a lot of investment in quantum technologies in the UK, and you can leverage that for the space domain. So there's definitely an opportunity sitting there for the UK. Some of the key sort of areas or technologies were in quantum key distribution, quantum enhanced clocks, and quantum sensors. The opportunities in terms of the hardware, I guess, we're looking for miniaturization of quantum systems, ruggedizations for use in space. And there's a clear potential to impact on all 5 areas of the National Space Strategy. In terms of some recommendations, so there was a recommendation that a national space quantum technology strategy would be beneficial to leverage that investment from the National Quantum Technology Program. Development of a supply chain for those miniaturized and ruggedized components, and then creation of a skilled workforce to work in this domain. And one of the ways to do that would be through centers for doctoral training in quantum technologies for space. And there was also a recommendation that this could be the development of quantum technologies for space could be facilitated by a small satellite program. I should add that there was absolutely no direction for myself to align the recommendations with the things that SPAN are recommending. So this was an independent outcome by Susan. It's a bit of a tour de force to get through 5 case studies in a short amount of time. So the next one really focused on the Euclid mission. So Euclid's been in development for probably 20 years. There's a history in conception and other missions, and it's going to be launched next year. It was scheduled for launch this year, but there have been some delays. So it's a groundbreaking medium-class mission to discover that, to study dark matter and dark energy in the universe. So there's going to be an exciting telescope that's going to go out to L2 or L1, I can't remember which, and it's going to monitor some 10 billion galaxies. And there are 2 different instruments on it. So the UK's led the visible imager. There's a picture of it there. The focal plane has got 36 large area CCDs. It's probably about 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter. The CCDs were supplied by Teledyne in the UK. And the UK also has responsibility in the science ground segment for the shear and distortion measurements, which are very much aligned with the goals of the VIS instrument. And this is all to do weak lensing. So gravitational distortion of galaxies will help elucidate where the hidden dark energy and dark matter is. So it's very exciting. And this ties into one of the other case studies as well. And so I'll talk more about Euclid a little bit later. Again, there were some recommendations made by this case study. So one of the main messages is that ESA is an excellent partnership for collaborative science missions. Another recommendation was actually about the need for kind of established scientific pathways. So investment in sort of early phase 0 studies. And it's something where we're not necessarily that strong on in the UK. And for future success, we often talk about punching above our weight in space science in the UK. But if we want to be successful in the future, some investments need to be made now. The UK does have strong leadership within ESA, and combining this with the bilaterals and a national program would help strengthen our position in space science going forward. And there was strong messages about support to knowledge transfer and industrial academic partnership, particularly around the areas of the CCDs for Euclid, but there are other examples as well that can be drawn out. So in terms of the link to the National Space Strategy, it's very closely aligned to pioneering scientific discovery and inspiring the nation. The third case study was about how the UK benefits from ESA Earth observation missions. So quite a challenge. There's a lot of, there have been many ESA Earth observation missions over the years. So Steve, who wrote this, was particularly speaking to his own experience. And from his perspective, he was saying that, industry benefits from these missions. They build the instrumentations, but also they use the data and create services. So there's a whole sort of ecosystem of small companies, startups, and even some of the large companies as well that are benefiting from these scientific missions. There's demonstrable technical leadership. The particular example he chose was RAL Space and the development of the long-track scanning a long-track scanning radiometer, where they had a 5-fold improvement in performance in that instrument. But it's just one example that can be brought to the fore. The benefits in growth of scientific knowledge and capability. We heard from Andy Shaw's talk about how the Met Office is heralded as a world centre for climate research and modelling. And our scientific capability is driving into that. On ground segments as well, the UK is involved in the ground segments of all of the EO missions, European EO missions. So it's developing, we have considerable expertise in the UK in EO data processing. I said it'd be a tour de force. Knowledge transfer, there's a given example in the case study of knowledge transfer in between industry and academia and government as well. Particularly in EO, I think it's a strong area where the science can drive policy for government. And we've heard today about the importance of science for climate change. On public inspiration, at the moment, I think it's sort of the climate crisis and awareness of these issues are high on the public agenda. And there's some statistics quoted there about how it's placed in the top 3 by around 30% of the population. EO missions also lead to recognition for UK scientists. So in 2020, several Antarctic glaciers were featured, named after famous UK scientists. I'll skip over the recommendations because I've had a time warning, and I'll go on to the hunt for dark matter. So this piece written by Fiona was a bit broader. So she posed a question, why hunt for dark matter? Why do we care? It links back into Euclid, which is a mission that's doing this. So put yourself back in, the late 1800s when J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. Who could imagine then our dependence on microelectronics and what we do with them today? It's just unthinkable where that would go. You can draw a parallel and say, okay, what we might discover about dark energy and dark matter, where might that take us in the future? In her case study, there are also messages about how it's not only ESA, but we also rely on ESO, the European Southern Observatory, for astronomical instrumentation, how the two are closely linked together. We subscribe to ESO as we do to ESA. And then there were some examples of technology, both in hardware and software and capabilities that get transferred. So, for example, how laser guides stars, which are used on ground-based astronomy, the technology and know-how is used in management, monitoring and management of space debris, or starting to be done. And in vertical benefits described here, how sort of the expertise in identifying objects in astronomical data and sifting for needles in haystacks, if you were, is starting to feed into things like cancer diagnosis. And her final point was sort of imagine no ESA. So in order to sort of imagine what it would be like with no ESA, you've got to appreciate what it does for us in space science. In the science program, it's a mechanism for international collaboration. You know, there are things that are done collaboratively through ESA that we cannot do alone, and our partners cannot do alone. It shares risk and it shares cost, and it forges those international partnerships. So without an organization like ESA, I think, you know, the discovery element of science would be severely hampered. The final case study was written by Leonani, also thinking about cosmic visions, but talking more about innovation, knowledge transfer, and leadership. She wrote this from her experience of working in the magnetometer lab of Imperial College London. So there are the three sort of elements underpinning this was, you know, the development, the innovation, so going from analog hardware into digital at the time, through Digimag. Knowledge transfer was the exchange of that knowledge between academia and industry. And then on winning bids, how a small investment went on to much larger return. And another strong message from her case study was how the experience of the teams in the magnetometer lab on missions such as IMAP, JUICE, Cassini, and SOLO, those people didn't just stay in academia. They went on to do other things. They went into other sectors. They went on to start companies, you know, leaders in the nuclear sector, in aerospace, and so on. And it leads on to influence as well. You know, people who develop their skills on these missions go on to lead groups and teams. So my final slide. If I haven't managed to bring it out today, here I think each case study links to the National Space Strategy. Quantum technologies, as I mentioned, has relevance to all 5 goals of the space strategy. Earth observation, I see links to all 5 goals of the space strategy. Across the 3 case studies for the science program, I think it's demonstrated, or to me, I feel that it's clear that scientific discovery involves leadership, it inspires, it supports the wider economy, with knowledge and skilled people. It benefits industry, not just in contracts, but just in the knowledge that can be gained from new developments, either in software, hardware, analytics. And it involves international collaboration. It's a pillar of being a science superpower. So I'd like to end at that point, and I guess we have time later for questions. Thank you.
Time now just to take some questions, generic questions from, there's a microphone with Munawar at the back. What I would say is what we've been trying to do here is not perfect, okay? We have been a small team with some consultants, with some secondees from industry. I've been on this at 3.5 days a week. The vast majority of us have been on this at 1 to 2 days a week, and it's not perfect. But I'm speaking to an audience who know that space is hard, whether it's technical, commercially, economic, scientifically. It's a hard community. It's a technically difficult, it's behaviourally difficult, and everybody in this room knows that my phone's got space connected to it, my car's got space connected to it, and trying to unpick that all of the time is really, really difficult. We have had a steering group in place. We tried to put in some light touch governance. Stuart, as he mentioned earlier, chaired it. On the steering group was Nick Shave, Andrew Holland of SPAN. I've got to remember everybody's names now that I've started this journey. We also had Harshbir Sangha from the UK Space Agency. We had Philip Thomas and Kathy from BAYS, and we also had Graham Peters, who has chaired the Space Growth Partnership Board to bring that continuity. So we have had some governance, and we were set out with 2 tasks. We were asked to deliver a business case, which we're going to talk about at very high level this afternoon, but a business case for that, and we've produced that. It's a very nice light touch paper at 36 pages. And we were also asked to try and demonstrate the partnership. And, you know, this is hard, right? And we've picked some subjects. Actually, we didn't pick those subjects. Those subjects came out of a consultation that went on for 2 years, mostly centred around industry. We openly admit that. We know it's not perfect, but you've got to start somewhere to try and test a concept. So we tried to do that, and I think, you know, this evidence-based approach is really important. Everybody in this room can link anything they're doing on an individual basis to the National Space Strategy. The issue is, you know, to be able to articulate that with evidence rather than I'm doing X and that hits goals 4, 5 and 6. I'm doing Y and it hits points 3, 4, 5 of the 10-point plan. Evidence is about what does it do to our skills, what does it do to our economy, what does it do to our social standing, what does it do to levelling up, very specifically. And that's where the partnership, I really believe, will come in. So I'm very happy to stand here and take a couple of questions about the more broader point around the partnership, but I also get that it's 1:15, you all might want your lunch, and I'm standing in between you. But as I say, Munawar has got or if there's questions for any of the people who have spoken, they're very capable of jumping up and answering those questions, but we're happy to take some questions if there are any at this stage. Everybody goes very shy. Oh, no, hello.
Hi, thanks, Ruth. Just a quick one. Thank you for...
Could you let us know where you're from, please,
Oh, sorry,
so that everybody...
I'm Louise Rees from Reotech Group in the UK. So just a quick one. You mentioned there about governance and you have a steering board which has been set up. Now, obviously, for the National Space Partnership, one of the things that's been mentioned a number of times is the independence and trust of that.
I agree.
So what form of model will you be, you know, is going to be anticipated moving forward? Is it going to be one where people are voted on? Because to get the independence and neutrality and unbiased, as you know, you mentioned the people on the steering board there, but actually what, you know, democratic process will there be, or?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's a really great question, actually. So this was a pilot, you know, we didn't sort of have bandwidth or time, and please forgive us for that. It feels like a really stock answer of I didn't have time to do that, so I did this, and please forgive us for that. I think moving forwards, you know, there is some further work to do on the financial model. It is my absolute firm belief that if this is going to be a partnership, it has to be funded, physically funded by government and industry and academia, which raises a whole stack of issues of models, but I think that is point one. So the operation is co-owned in that financial side. I think the board of, this was just purely an interim, you know, otherwise Ruth was going to be doing what she wanted when she wanted, and I thought I need someone checking me. You know, whether they felt they were checking me, I don't know, but I felt we needed that. But from our perspective and what we've been putting in the business case is going forward, the governance of the partnership would need an independent chair, so somebody who is recruited formally. I think there should be a couple of independent non-exec directors on that organisation's board, again, recruited formally. And then I think there should be representation from government, industry and academia. Whether this is done by positioning in, you know, the people who are voted, like, you know, Nick is, you know, has been appointed the chair of UK Space through a process. Whether it is that kind of representation or another one, I don't know, but it needs to be decided. But absolutely, I think the chair of that board must be independent to give it the credibility of starting from that footing. I hope that helps. It's a bit, you know, still unknown, but that's I think the direction of travel goes. What I would add is that model is the model that the Aerospace Technology Institute has used. So it's got, you know, industry, government and academia on there. It's got an independent chair. It's got independent non-exec directors. Advanced Propulsion Centre, same model. So there's that neutrality. Anything else? I can't believe that you're all that quiet and shy. Hello. There's another question over here. If you could state your name for me, because I'm sorry I don't know as many
Hi.
people as other people know.
I'm Minnie Sarge. I'm a professor at the University of Lincoln. I just want to make a remark. So today we heard a lot about industry-academia partnerships, and my colleague James, he also spoke about the SPAN activities, and you gave a nice color about the space science programs. But I would like to also add that jointly with industries, the UK space universities are also supporting a range of space technology programs, not just science. So space technology is also equally advancing. I would say, as a technologist, I would confidently say that it's far more ahead. And I want to also emphasize that we are getting a lot of support from the UK Space Agency, Innovate UK, BASE, and obviously Minister Freeman and his team. They're all supporting our initiatives on robotic missions, hopefully, which will be led by UK at some point within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
So I just want to emphasize that it's not just space science. We are equally driving space technology and robotic exploration from UK's national space program point of view.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. It's, again, this is what I find about the community, is that you try to take things up to a strategic level and then somebody's very specific issue hasn't been articulated. And, I think it's an amazing sector. I've been working in and out of the space sector since 2010. I don't disagree that, it's systemic to our lives, to the inspiration that it brings. But we spend a lot of time talking to ourselves as a community rather than trying to sort of forge ahead around the growth or the scientific agenda, and always sort of saying, but what about? And the strategy is there, it's a framework. I think we need to work with BASE and the Space Agency on with the National Space Board, 7 working groups. How can we get industry and academia pulling into those to take the strategy forward? But I do take your point, and I'm really grateful for it. And another one.
Hello, Robin Tucker, Red Kite Management Consulting. So there's a lot of opportunity, we've just heard some in the case studies, but there's opportunity for space in things like monitoring biodiversity gain and carbon sequestration, maybe road pricing, things like that. Those require actions by government to put in the regulations or create the markets that will enable them. And the NSP may be a way of starting those off. Mm-hmm. So do you think the government part of the involvement in the NSP so that needs to involve not just space but other government departments as well? Do you think the government involvement will be at the right level and cross-sectoral enough to enable that?
So I feel a bit embarrassed. Kathy's sat right in front of me. So speaking on behalf of Kathy, but for me, I think that's what they're leading at the moment, is the National Space Board, which is cross-government. It has got multi-department involvement, so that's stage one. I think that pulls that department thinking in. I think, again, I think what's interesting is what I hear in the space community is we need to talk about regulation over here, we need to talk about markets over here, we need to talk about EO over here, PNT over here. And yet, actually, if you try to line them up and how they all talk to each other in a, say, greener finance market, so to go towards that market, what are the challenges, which we've talked about, what are the space systems? Is there a regulatory change that needs to happen to enable that to happen? Is there a capability that we're missing that we need to pull through to get that market going? So for me, there's something about where the National Space Partnership would be able to knit some of those things together to create a much more sort of cohesive argument of the levers to make things happen, which would need you to work with DIT and with BASE and with Treasury and with DEFRA in that way, so that you start to create that sort of, as I say, a cohesive perspective going forwards. I hope that's helpful. I can't tell. Just nod your head. Oh, and another one. Hello, John.
Hi, John Remedios, Director of National Centre for Earth Observation at University of Leicester. It may not be a question for you, Ruth. It might be as much a question for the consultants or the people doing the individual studies. But
yes.
I suppose two things struck me. very open-ended, how do you put a timescale on a project like intelligent supply chains if you're trying to do it over a longer period of time? You had weeks, so it was really hard. So how do you put a timescale? And the second thing that struck me was, and I see this a lot in my role, is how do you find the expert? And interesting comment by a colleague from Lincoln. How do you find the expert when you're really straddling, very large areas where your people in a particular organisation might not be the expert? Somebody else might actually have that knowledge, which makes the difference. So I just wondered if there were any comments, just lessons learned, I suppose.
So I'm happy to take them, and then the guys I've been working with are very happy to jump in. So on the meeting timescales, I think that's about mapping. I think that's about markets and road mapping. And if you take the role of PNT, for instance, in the advancements that we need to make on autonomous transportation systems, then we kind of have a sense of when they need to come in, so therefore we have a sense of what needs to happen, therefore we have a sense of when we have to have resilience communications. So I think the market can shift that timescale. So I think the space community did some amazing technology road mapping around about 2010. I don't know who the person was who led that. I know, it was me. So I think we did some amazing work and we started. I think there needs to be a re-engagement with technology and market road mapping to lay that down. It is really hard. You can't get one road map, but I think that's really very, very doable to create that timeline of criticality. And then how do you find the expert? And I think that is also a really, really good question. And I think the NSP should house some people who understand how to understand markets. I think it should have some people who understand economics and science policy at a really big level, high level, but a strategic level. And then I think you should have a balance of space capabilities. So that actually, more than anything, it's not what the NSP thinks. It's not about what I think. What I think doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't it just doesn't matter. What matters is having people in the NSP who can listen to experts and then knit it back together. Or can listen to experts and say, that is an absolute pipe dream, or actually that is very valid because, and then knit it back together. So they have to have enough knowledge to understand that, but be curious enough to go out. And again, these are the models of the hydrogen community, they're evolving in this. These are the models of the aerospace community. So it's not what the ATI thinks, because what ATI thinks is what industry thinks. And then about how you push that back through. Is there anything the team wanted to add on that, or is it okay?
Sorry, just microphone.
Yeah, just attempting to answer your second question. So I can give you an example where we were, when I say we, it's not just academia, but it's an industry forum, which is part of the UK space. So we were able to directly feed into UK Space Agency's programs, exactly addressing your second question on what should be UK's priorities when it comes to robotic missions. So we worked with Satellite Applications Catapult and 20 plus companies, large, medium and small. We did an extensive market survey over many years and came up with a breakdown of what should be the UK's priorities when it comes to investment on robotic missions, especially looking at market opportunities for in-orbit businesses. And this was directly fed to UK Space Agency, which was further fed to BASE. And obviously, the ministerial team is also now taking those recommendations on board. So we are able to directly feed into those programs. And I believe similar case studies are happening for the other space sectors as well.
Thank you. All right, so thank you for that. So we're going to now break for some lunch. There are some really wide questions on some flip charts outside, and it'd be really great, and they are really, really wide questions about the role of the NSP. What have you heard today? Where could it focus? Where do you as a community think it should start to take in its direction if it goes further forward? So it'd be great to get some sense of that. And, you've seen all the core team up here. Go talk to them, go ask them the questions, and probe a bit more deeply about what the National Space Partnership could be doing. We're coming back this afternoon. We're going to talk about the engagement approach, an iterative engagement approach, a bit around the case for, and then you've got an opportunity. The interim steering group is going to be up here. We're going to be up here fielding those questions. You've got us for 45 minutes, so that's quite a long time. So you can ask some really big, solid, wide questions of the steering group. All right, thank you very much. I hope this has been useful this morning. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back here shortly.